Arizona is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Extreme temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, venomous wildlife lurks around every corner, and there's also that bizarre risk of flash floods. Floods that happen despite the fact that average yearly precipitation is only 13.6 inches, bringing us to the greatest concern of all. Access to potable water has always been next to impossible. Even so, based on appearances, you'd never guess it was the case. Figures from the U.S. Geological Survey suggest that on a daily basis, Arizona consumes a magnificent 6 to 7 billion gallons of water. The state is home to over 8 million people, meaning approximately 41 million toilet flushes and 10 million showers happen every single day. Add those figures to things like local crop irrigation or industrial use, and it starts to seem like a miracle that anyone calls Arizona home. These challenges are only expected to get worse as both high-tech expansion and population growth will boom in the decades to come. Under that lens, pessimistic headlines claim that the water might run out as soon as this summer, with cities like Phoenix becoming entirely uninhabitable by the end of the century, which is not the case. Leaders have been preparing for this crisis all the way back to the founding father of Phoenix. And he designed Arizona's first waterworks based on an ancient system that the natives had relied upon for centuries. So why won't Arizona run out of water? And where does all that water come from anyway? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the story of Arizona's waterworks. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start off by acknowledging something fundamental. Desert civilizations without human engineering was always impossible, and evidence of this is not hard to find. In fact, archaeologists have long known that Arizona's first inhabitants designed a sprawling canal system starting at the Salt River and spanning into branches of nearly 500 miles in total. Leading theories suggest that these canals were created to irrigate approximately 110,000 acres of farmland, with yields capable of supporting a population of up to 80,000 residents. These estimates are further reinforced by the vast amount of objects such as arrowheads or clay pots found within the same region. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, as thousands of European settlers began arriving in Arizona in search of precious resources like gold. Initially, they found themselves in an environment so hostile that they became geographically limited to the few areas with fresh water, in particular, the areas around the Salt River. However, even that proved deadly when seasonal flash floods caused by Arizona's sun-baked, thus non-porous soil would take out entire outposts, along with the first primitive dams and reservoirs that these men tried to establish. Regarding ground wells, they would strike water, but as population growth continued, those supplies were depleted rapidly. This is when a man named Jack Swilling, often referred to as the father of Phoenix, had rediscovered that ancient canal system and recognized that if it could be revitalized, local industries would thrive. With that, on November the 16th, 1867, he formed the Swilling Irrigation and Canal Company, with excavation work beginning in the months to follow. By 1870, a small farming community called Phoenix was born. This was a special moment in Arizona's history, as farmers joined miners, the first steps in the state's transformation beyond just a rugged mining outpost had been made. That momentum was only amplified with the arrival of the railroads in the 1880s, as the otherwise isolated valley became a major regional trade center. Now linked to powerful national markets, businessmen from the north took interest and began establishing their corporate foothold accordingly. As the population expanded, so too did the waterworks. Some reservoirs were installed around the state to capture and contend with seasonal flooding, but it was problematic. The engineers struggled to comprehend the forces at hand, a state of affairs which resulted in tragedy. In February of 1890, a period of heavy rain led to the 25-year flood, causing one of Arizona's early dams, the Walnut Grove Dam, to give way, releasing billions of gallons of water down the canyon. Witnesses recall that a 50-foot tall wall of water engulfed a lower diversion dam, washed away workers' camps, company headquarters, and other operations, ultimately killing 50 people in the process. News of the disaster spread nationwide, in the end, prompting a lobby for federal aid. Among other things, the US government responded with the construction of the Roosevelt Dam. And although Arizona was still capturing the same source natives relied upon throughout history, two things changed completely. The supply was stabilized, and the Salt River was now insulated from major floods. With that in place, by World War II, Phoenix's population swelled as the US military set up training fields and factories in the area. And then after the war, thousands of young veterans who had trained at bases like Luke Field actually returned to Arizona to build their lives. They purchased homes, established new businesses, and created communities in a way that the region had not yet experienced. In turn, Phoenix's business leaders shifted their economic focus from agriculture to technology. Motorola opened its first facility in Phoenix in 1949, and from that point forward, the city became synonymous with aerospace, defense, and microelectronics. And once word was out, dozens of additional tech manufacturing firms relocated to the valley over the next 2 decades. And when the widespread adoption of affordable air conditioning became available in the 1950s, hundreds of thousands of families and retirees elected to call the state their new home. And it needs to be emphasized that air conditioning, perhaps more than anything else up to this point in the story, transformed Arizona. Though, as the suburbs rose, the water supply fell. By the mid-20th century, a catastrophe was on the horizon. Residents were pumping groundwater 500 times faster than the supply could replace it, and the ramifications of this were dramatic. Aquifers were collapsing, and the land was beginning to sink. Officials knew that they needed a new lifeline to the Colorado River, but a fierce conflict of interest with California stood in the way, and this was a long-standing issue. At one point, in 1934, Arizona went as far as deploying its National Guard to prevent construction on the river. Though it didn't help matters, the solution needed to be amicable. So, to accomplish their goals, political giants like Carl Hayday and Barry Goldwater enacted the Colorado River Basin Project Act in 1968. But there was a catch. To get the project funded, Arizona had to accept junior water rights, meaning if the river ever ran low, Arizona would be the first to face cuts while California remained protected. Furthermore, the federal government issued an ultimatum in the late 1970s. Their position was that unless Arizona passed strict laws to stop overpumping, funding for the project would be pulled. This pressure birthed the Groundwater Management Act of 1980, and with it came the Central Arizona Project, also known as CAP, resulting in a 336-mile-long aqueduct that traverses key population centers of the state. Now, because the water traveled uphill 2,900 feet in elevation along the way, the system uses 14 pumping plants, making CAP the largest single consumer of electricity in the state. The aqueduct also drops the water into subterranean tubes of up to 21 feet in diameter. That's large enough to drive a semi-truck through. And for decades, this man-made river fulfilled the dream of bringing roughly 1.5 million acre-feet of water annually to residents. It allowed cities like Phoenix and Tucson to grow and provided a steady supply of water to nearly 1 million acres of farmland. Furthermore, the state began water banking, which is the practice of recharging underground reservoirs as a failsafe in times of drought. Yet, even with supply diversification in place, many Arizonans were working against their own progress by trying to make the desert look like the places they left behind. They were planting lush green lawns, non-native trees, and so on. And just to remind you, that could bring risk to the federal terms, which is why the state brought about a reckoning known as the Groundwater Management Act. By 1987, the state's priorities completely hardlined against waste. Lawmakers essentially decreed that using drinking water for vanity was over. They banned decorative lakes in new subdivisions, outlawed newly irrigated farmland, and mandated that no new neighborhood could be built without proof of a 100-year water supply. But fortunately, Arizonans embraced it, sparking a cultural shift. In the 90s and 2000s, cities like Scottsdale and Tucson literally paid homeowners to rip out their lawns, forced housing density upward to slash per capita demand, and mandated that golf courses irrigated fairways with treated wastewater rather than pristine groundwater. Even the state's leisure industries joined the retreat from the potable supplies. By 2006, the sprawling green fairways of Arizona's golf courses had reached a milestone, with approximately 28% of their irrigation statewide drawn from reclaimed wastewater. rather than the state's dwindling reserves. So it was through these combined efforts that Arizona was able to provide its people with water. And for the most part, it was working fine until a so-called megadrought hit. And newspapers began reporting that the taps will go dry and that the state itself will soon become uninhabitable. Currently, the supply from the Colorado River, the state's primary lifeline, is in what's called structural deficit, a situation where more water is taken out than nature puts back in. The result is a striking ring around Lake Mead, illustrating just how far the water has fallen. Unfortunately for Arizona, their junior rights have also been called into effect. In both 2024 and 2025, systems finally crossed a threshold that triggered a Tier 1 shortage. For Arizona, this meant a sudden loss of 512,000 acre-feet of its supply. The scale of that loss is difficult to overstate. It represents 30% of the normal supply carried by the aqueduct. It's roughly 18% of the state's total Colorado River supply and nearly 8% of all the water used annually across the state. However, this didn't mean that the people went without water. Rather, they began effectively wiping out the state's other stores. And most notably, the farmers have been paying the price. Agricultural canals have dried up so that municipal drinking water can remain protected. In other words, threats of cuts to major cities like Tucson remain highly unlikely, but the state will need to further diversify. And the situation might be resolved politically, since the current rules governing the Colorado River are set to expire in 2026. In a recent joint proposal by Arizona, California, and Nevada, a new framework was suggested to stabilize the river. Though, under this plan, Arizona would still bear a staggering 61% total loss of their basin reductions. So, in a worst-case scenario, the Central Arizona Project estimates that the federal proposal for the river could eventually cost Arizona's economy up to $2.7 trillion between now and 2060. Yet, even if the current river system were to collapse entirely, it wouldn't mean an apocalyptic end to the state's tap water. Indeed, hyperlocalized, unpiped counties might temporarily resort to importing water by truck. Large urban centers would still have their emergency supply, and that buys them time. Ultimately, a deal could be made with California or Sonora, Mexico, to pipe in salt water for desalination with the help of solar power, as many other desert nations are currently doing to great success. And for those of you who still remain unconvinced that Arizona won't run out of water, I'd like to point out one final fact from history. Arizona was the birthplace of solar-powered water infrastructure. All the way back in 1903, inventors built massive, mirror-lined sun engines to boil water into steam, driving mechanical pumps that irrigated the desert, whereas other pioneers built low-profile, so-called hot boxes that could store the sun's daytime heat to pump groundwater even after dark. Let that sink in. These devices, which still look futuristic from today's perspective, were designed and operated in Arizona all the way back at the turn of the 20th century and to pump water. So, where there's a will, there's a way. We'll leave it there for today, but a special dedication for anyone watching from Arizona. Let me know if anyone's watching from Arizona in the comment section below. I'm quite curious. I actually had the pleasure of living in Tucson and Douglas, of all places, before I moved away to Poland to never return. And yeah, I guess my point is that Arizona is a magical, wonderful place. And I sure hope that you guys won't run out of water, because it'll make me look bad. As always, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.